So with this, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we, and it was our way of trying to see how we could fit it into sort of Civic Tech's operating model. This is very valuable to have resident feedback. We thought it was super important to have it. How can we create something that might be sustainable and not just doing internal projects for us? How can we still have this be a valuable part of other people's work? It's a group that exists and is really excited to be able to give feedback around this. So how can we do that? Of course, this was sort of what we came up with and iterated on, and a few like some examples of what we did. So looking at extra, so we, like I said, we used it as like an internal resource and an external resource. So a couple of examples, there's a lot of words, but I'll go through it quickly. So on the external side, a couple of things, we leveraged our work to engage residents and community stakeholders around the Auburn Gresham area and nearby neighborhoods, because we worked with OSF Healthcare. So OSF Healthcare had recently, they're a healthcare company who's primarily rural, but had recently were leading Little Company of Mary Medical Center, which is near the Auburn Gresham neighborhood, and wanted to better understand what the health and wellness experiences and needs were of that community. And so we were able to use to reach out to the CUTgroup, reach out to people who lived in that area through CUTgroup, and really understand, like, what do you need? What are you looking for? How can OSF and how can Little Company of Mary Medical Center better serve your needs? And we did that through a survey. We did that, and then we did that through focused conversations. We're able to share the feedback back to OSF, and they were able to implement, and they're continuing to think about how to implement some of those changes within that neighborhood. That was sort of a full-on engagement. We did all of the work from talking to OSF and understanding what their needs, recruiting, selecting people, running those discussions, like creating the survey or creating the focus group, running the questions, running those, and then analyzing it and going back to us and saying, this is what we heard, here are the results, here's what people are looking for. As I had mentioned, there were sort of two different ways we were thinking about it, that full piece of it. And then we were also thinking about how do we do this with like a recruiting type piece. And we worked with the Center for Data and Computing at University of Chicago through some funding from a grant from grant.org. We worked on a project with CUTgroup to better understand broadband connectivity in underserved communities. And so for them, they really needed they wanted to run sort of the process, and we our piece on it was helping with that recruitment. So we were written into the grant and worked with them to work on the recruitment, make sure the residents understood sort of what the process was, could answer any questions during it, and then pass them along to CUTgroup, who then did the testing around it. Internally, it's a similar type of process. It's just internal to our projects. So, we utilized the CUTgroup to really think about EV testing or EV cars and EV charging. So we leveraged CUTgroup to sort of think about what is the user experience for that like for people with electric vehicles right now. What are people looking for? What might people need to be able to use something like electric vehicles? So worked with, it was ourselves and what is now a spin out of Civic Tech called the Civic Infrastructure Collaborative. We also, I had mentioned the Navy Pier project. We really wanted to understand what made people feel safe. Like what did people need to start to come back into public spaces? This was right when things were reopening. How do we make sure this is accessible to people? Where do they want to get information? How can we help them feel safe? So had a number of conversations with residents from our CUTgroup to better understand that and start to think about, is there like a tool that Navy Pier can build that will help the residents better access information if they were to want to come to Navy Pier? So there's just a couple of examples of projects that we've done with our CUTgroup. So as you can imagine, we thought really hard about how to do all of this, but of course we faced a lot of barriers, right? It's a little bit of reflective, but a couple of things I'll sort of point out here. So as I mentioned, we really thought about what does a service model look like? And one of the, it's nice because a service model is nice because it is, it does provide the funding to be able to pay the CUTgroup members. So it does keep it sort of sustainable, but at the same time, it makes it sort of harder to work with a lot of groups because you are charging for this now. And it's hard. It's also, it's a little bit hard to say, I think this is a super, like, I really truly believe this is a super important part of this, but also we can't do it unless we get some money for it, right? That's a weird thing to say sometimes. You want to just do it because you know it's important, but just to be able to sustain even paying the people who were giving their time for this, we needed to figure out the service model. So with that service model, as I said, it was harder to work with some people. The city is a really good example. I think with some of the engagements that came before us, they did a really good job working with the city. And once we moved to a service model, it was harder to do that due to procurement type issues. It's just a little bit more difficult when you're charging for something like that, unless you're written into a grant or you can find some sort of way to do a master service agreement or something like that. We also found, a lot of organizations were really interested in utilizing this programming. I think during my time, during the 2-3 years that I was working on this at City Tech, I think I scoped maybe 30 plus projects in talking to different organizations. But they were interested in what it meant, but they either wouldn't be able to devote the budget or the time to it. If you're thinking about if you're building something out, if your funds are tight and you don't have the money to build it, then it doesn't matter if you have money to test, like you're not going to test it without building it first. And similarly, when timelines run short, this seemed to be something that got cut out really, really frequently. And so that's also difficult with something like the service model. As you can imagine, some of that made the activity a little bit less consistent with CUTgroup, right? And so there were less tests that we were able to do because of some of these barriers that we faced. And so without that consistent activity, it's also hard to prove value when you're engaging with an organization. Like you can't say, I did 20 of these last week, and so of course, please hire us to do this. And then also without that consistent activity, it's easier to lose some CUTgroup members. Like we've heard feedback that, we're like, as a member, I'm really interested in participating. Why don't you have anything for me to do? And, we're trying on our end, but it's hard to do that. And it's also hard to justify recruiting new members if you don't have a lot of, projects for them to engage with. Like why go through the trouble of recruiting someone and have them sort of sit on a list when you already have a large list. And so for a lot of our recruitment, we did it sort of organically, where every time we'd send out a call, even if it was for like a specific group that the test was looking for, we would sort of send out a call to the entire 1,600 resident group and say, if this isn't right for you, but someone who is, send it to them. And from there, we sort of like grew on the fringes. But we always wanted to recruit more, but again, we didn't want to waste people's time if we couldn't justify with enough sort of tests for them. And then the final one is very COVID related. So all of these, we used to do all of our tests in person. It was a great way for us to engage with people. We usually meet in sort of very public spaces like libraries or central public spaces. It was a great way for us to provide the technology. This is sort of how CUTgroup was set up, again, before my time, but being able to provide the technology so that people who don't have the technology can still come in and use it. With COVID, we shifted online, which of course makes it harder because it left some people without the people who didn't have connectivity or didn't have the digital skills, left them without access to the opportunity. One sort of pro that came out of that, though, like the sort of bright side of it, we did have a number of people when they shifted online say, look, we didn't used to have childcare, we didn't have the right transportation, there were all these other barriers that stopped people from being able to engage with us, and they were now able to work and be on a test, which is something they'd wanted to do for a while. So a couple of things, like just reflecting a little bit more. sort of this idea of creatively overcoming barriers. You know, as I mentioned, this is really important in the real world, or it's really important in an ideal world. We'd want to build it into every part of any sort of development process, but time and funding isn't always making it feasible. So some of the things that we were trying to do to make it, to creatively do this, is identify sort of the areas along the pipeline where there may be more appetite for it. So this is sort of thinking about, okay, well, we can't do it at all stages, but can you do it at the beginning? Can you do it in the middle, at the end? Is there a place where it fits in better, or maybe it's more likely for uptake? Or are there smaller multi-part engagements where you can sort of come in, they can see you do the small part not even almost every time. Every time that I've been a part of this, it's very clear that the people who are seeing the results see the value in it. There's huge value in doing this, right? Things you never think about, that the people who are using it, you all know user testing is super important. I don't need to tell you, but this idea of how do you prove that value? And even just coming in a little bit and showing them in real life would often open the door up a little bit more for them to realize, okay, this is important to do. Funding piece is a huge barrier, right? A sustainable cut group requires funding, whether that comes through being anchored in an organization or through a service model. At the bare minimum, you need it to pay the testers, but also the funding for the staff and cut group leads is really helpful for sort of continuing that leadership and continuing that model. If it's always switching out, it's hard to sort of have continuity in that process and make improvements, because there's always someone new coming in. So the creative part of that, I guess, is thinking about, is there a service model? Can it be part of an organization? We've talked to other civic user testing groups where this has been part of the organization, and that part of an organization, like a Code for America type of organization, where there is funding specifically set aside to do this, and that can help. Or is there a way to anchor it to government, to the local government, where they want to do it from internally or something like that? Make it a little bit more, and then a little bit more sustainable. And then pivoting again with this COVID type example. The barrier is that it may change who you're able to accommodate, but if you can have an upside to it, so looking for ways that yield balance when possible. So I already mentioned my COVID example, but moving it online took away access for some people, but at least we were able to increase access for other people. So if something like this comes up where you absolutely have to shift, how can you do it in a way where other people can still join? I'm going to talk about just a couple more things very quickly. So we also, along with Chicago's civic user testing, there are also civic user testing groups across the US. Smart Chicago and really Sonia Marzano, who was leading the CUTgroup work at Smart Chicago and then also brought it over to City Tech, sort of helped the transition over. She worked with some other cities to set up some of these things. I know she worked with Miami, with Detroit, and then we worked with Toronto and Cleveland to sort of set up civic user testing groups in those cities. They're not always called CUTgroup. Toronto's is called GRIT, which is gathering residents. I'm gonna miss it. I had it a second ago, but it's called GRIT, and they're doing great work there. But so we sort of brought everyone together into a network. The thought being, how can we create a network for current and future groups to share best practices, resources? How can you potentially even leverage it for multi-city testing engagements? So is it something where, is it their value in testing something in Chicago and Detroit, Cleveland, Miami, all of these places, and seeing what are the common things that happen across the cities? How can we help each other? At City Tech's close, the network included 5 cities. So those are the 5 you see, with Cleveland and Toronto being the newest. Seattle and Oakland were previously network members, but temporarily paused their programs with COVID. And that was, one of the good examples of times where it wasn't necessarily anchored in a funding thing, and there were, they worked to do it, and just with circumstances they paused their programs for a minute. We formalized a network with the charter that was signed by all 5 members, and we would meet regularly before sort of COVID, and a lot of these things slowed down a little bit. And one of the examples of what we worked with Cleveland was to provide ongoing training and support for the new CUTgroup Cleveland. And we worked with them to conduct their first test. So we were sort of able to help them set up, pass things along, and also sort of prove the agility of the network. I was set to go to Cleveland to help with the test in March of 2020 when everything shut down, like literally the week things shut down. And so we had to pivot to online testing, and we were able to sort of work through best practices, think about how to run the test remotely, and deliver the results to the app developers. I'm going to apologize. I have a child that is I have a baby that's going to sleep, and you might be able to hear it in the background crying. I'm so sorry. One thing that setting up these different civic user testing groups help us look at sort of what types of roles are required within civic user testing. And these are sort of ideal roles and responsibilities where you would need an execution lead. This is really someone who works across all of it. You need a community lead. These can all be the same people, but this is sort of roles that are required. So there needs to be some sort of community neighborhood type lead, someone who knows the people to be able to recruit. Ideally a funder, as we've talked about, that's really helpful in all of this. And then, who is your client that you're working with? And that client can be, the client can be your own organization, it can be internal or external, but like who are you doing the project for? Guys, I am so sorry. This is my 6-month-old Ashwin, who is very, very sad apparently that we are all on video, and he is not. So I will go through my last 2 slides with him. I am very sorry. So we are, CUTgroup with the transition. So CityTech closed its doors at the end of last year. And so we were thinking really hard about how do we transition this group, right? We have a number of, we have a group of 1,600 residents. Like what do? We can't just pass along those email addresses. Like that's not fair for privacy. And so we explored transitioning the CUTgroup to other organizations. We talked to a number of people, and some weren't really sure they could take it on during sort of what was happening with COVID and everything like that. They weren't really, sure it could be sustainable for their organization as well. Others weren't sure they could offer it as an external resource. So they were like, we will take, anyone who opts in, we'll take all your stuff, but we can only use it within our organization. And that's not super fair, given that there's so many people who have worked on this and it's such valuable resources. So what we decided to do is we decided to open source the methodology, tools, and templates in hopes that it could see future practices and program owners. This is some things that we saw happening in some of the other civic user testing groups that were sort of paused, and there's always a history of this work being available to the public anyway. It's always blogged about and everyone knows about it, and so we wanted to share it all. So we close a program following sort of data privacy, so telling all the members, deleting their information, and allowing them to opt in. So we sort of notified them that the program was closing, told them that we were handling their contact information, that we weren't sharing it, but allowed them to be sign up to be contacted by CityTech spin-out organizations, and then also gave them a reference point where they may be able to connect with other organizations. So this is for all of you who are listening right now. If your organization may be interested in doing this type of work and you want people who used to be part of the CUTgroup to contact you, drop me a note. We can put you up on the CityTech website. We also have open source resources. So if this is something that you want to do, this link here has all those resources on there. It is in no way how you have to do anything. It is just how we did it. And so it's some templates and things like that that might be useful. And some things, if we want some questions for discussion, is, as we went through, is how do we promote more engagement? What's the best way to engage with organizations, with CUTgroup members? What other service models are there? What's the best path to sustainability? What other funding models exist? Like, what do you think we did right? What can we do better? And what would you want to do? So thank you for bearing with me through the end of that, everyone.
Not a problem. We all get a bonus cutie on this live stream. So hello. I can attest to bedtime being very challenging. There may be loud noises behind me as well. Well, we have a number of questions from the chat, as well as some of our own. So we can just dive right on in. So the first one from the chat is, how are you handling the community engagement aspect of your internet equity project, or maybe how did you handle that?
Yeah, so what we did is we worked with the U Chicago team to work through what they were doing, sort of not tweak their research because it was research based, right? But like work with them to be like, how can what you're asking for be done by the residents you're asking them to do? Like, what does payment look like? What's fair? Like, work through those things. And then we helped with the recruiting piece of it. And so we reached out to our groups. We got responses. We sort of like worked with the survey that would go out. But we did tell the residents, like, we will not be involved in the actual testing. The testing was a long-term testing they wanted to do. It involved, it was a very specific thing where they wanted to send you a box that you put on your router at home, and were able to sort of see how well your connectivity was, and see how well your internet was performing. So it was a long term, it was like 6 months or something like that. And so they are working on it. And what we did with the engagement was really do sort of the recruitment piece of it and make sure that it was very clear and everyone sort of understood what they were getting into.
You want to do the next one, Miko?
Sure. Thank you for your answer. So is there an opportunity for the work of CUTgroup to be sustained under a different organization?
So that was, it's a great question. And that's what we sort of shopped around, is they talked to like Code for America. We talked to some of the university innovation centers. There were just quite a few groups who we talked to, and no one, and again, part of this is we would never pass along the email list without people opting in, right? Like part of this would be, we would email the cut group and say, we are closing, this group is taking over. If you're open to it, say yes, and then we'll pass along your email. And we just, given sort of the general times, it was hard to get a group who had the capacity to be able to work on this right now. And so right now, no. All the resources out there for if you would like to start something like that. And similarly, if you want people to sign up, when we emailed our cut group, we told them, keep an eye out on so the City Tech is closed, but our website is going to be open for like 3 years or something like that, and we can add to it. And so we sort of gave them the link that all the cut group info used to be on, saying, keep an eye out here. If other people are doing this kind of work, we'll put their contact info. You can reach out to them and sign yourself up.
Cool. Cool. So I have kind of a couple of questions. I guess, do you mind if we talk about like the finances of it? Because I feel like that's like a big piece of like the model, right?
Yeah.
So I think going back to your slides about sort of pitching this to potential clients or partners, right? And then them liking the idea, but then ultimately like saying no, they didn't want to pay for it. Do you generally know how much it costs to like run like one or a set or whatever the sort of unit of like user testing groups for a particular project is?
Yeah, so we basically are, before I tell you like the dollar amount, it was for paying the cut group members, like paying the people for their time, and then also like the staff time to do it, and then proctor time if proctors were relevant at that point. So that's what it encompassed. And it was usually, if you thought about sort of a standard usability test, it would be, and a lot of it depends on how many people you're recruiting, right? But let's say you're recruiting like 20 people, it would be like $8,000 to $10,000, which is much cheaper than like market research type testing, right? That runs like $15,000 to $18,000. And so we weren't trying to mark things up or anything like that, but it's still a cost. And especially for groups who are just starting up, it's a hard cost. And so recruiting would often be much cheaper depending on what people were looking for us to recruit for and how many people they were looking for us to recruit for and how much like we had to do, they'd like us to do like exit surveys and things like that. So that would be a cheaper amount, but that's sort of ballpark. Like I'd say depending on how big, like 8 to 12, which is a big range, but a lot of variables.
Okay, yeah. I mean, that makes sense. Honestly, yeah. I mean, it just it doesn't seem like that much considering the value you get out of it, especially considering obviously depending on the like project and like how much goes into like the tech side of things, right? Like so
Mhm.
yeah, that doesn't seem like a really high value. So okay, really interesting. Yeah, Miko, you wanna do the next one?
Sure. I'm going to ask one from the audience. Um, so has the city or other local government put out an RFP for this kind of service? Um, are you aware of any internal teams doing this kind of work in the local government in around Chicago area?
Yeah, so I mean, there have definitely been instances where different things in the city have used user testing. I know the CTA has their own group that they sort of email and be like, go test, different apps and things like that that we have. One thing that, if any of you remember when the city revamped their 311 service, that was a big user-driven effort. That was something that was run, I think, for them by Accenture. And that was something where that was one of the examples of something where we felt like that was really important that residents knew that was happening. We were not running it in any way, but that was something where we were like, we think this is part of the mission. It's the city's handling it. If you're interested, please go do it. Here's some information about it, right? So there's definitely places where they're doing it. I think times where we have worked with the city since it's been a service type model is like we've been able to get on grants. So if there's like federal funding coming in, we can get on that as sort of the resident, like the testing arm of it.
Cool. Yeah, so I think you had mentioned that like when comparing the costs, right, versus like another like research kind of organization, and I was thinking about that when you were talking about the model, like the service model. And when you were going through that kind of the iterations to try to like figure out what was the right model, did you ever look at how it compared to other kind of similar groups, like things that come to my mind like focus groups or polling or like just this broader practice of like user research? Did you like how did you sort of see CUTgroup sort of falling or compared to or falling in with those different kinds of practices in the same space?
We were generally on the, like in terms of cost, we were on the low end, if not cheaper than those types of things generally. Where we tried to be potentially, maybe not as much as like private groups who have much more money to give residents, but our goal was to be able to sort of, I think the best practices were like best ideal practices were $1 a minute for people participating. That ends up being quite pricey. It's a little bit hard to sustain, but we wanted to make sure, like if it was a 45-minute engagement, that that you were getting $35-40 because it is your time and it's important. So that's where we could have cut costs, but we obviously didn't want to do that. Creative ways that other civic engagement groups were doing this were like Grit is a good example, where they partnered with Lyft back when things were in person, and they would give people transportation vouchers to be able to come, so that they would pay them and then they would give them funding like that as well.
Cool. I think we might have time for maybe one or maybe two more. You want to do the next one, Miko?
I forgot to unmute myself. So let me ask about the members. How did you get your first CUTgroup users?
So it's a great question. So this was predating City Tech. So Smart Chicago really went out and they did a whole bunch of sort of outreach around this. So they worked with, they put flyers up, they were in local coffee shops and libraries, they talked to people, talked to different groups. They also offered an incentive. So they offered $5 to sign up for the list when you first started, so that, and then they could work from that list and engage. So that was the initial sort of push to get people in. As I mentioned, we did not do a lot of really active recruiting, just because we didn't feel like we had enough to offer for that active recruiting. And so we tried to do sort of gather a few people every time to have recruit. And we did. It was, I'd say probably every time we send something out, we get 10 to 20 people who got our email from someone else. So we'd always say, like, pass this along to someone else. So we wouldn't just recruit for the people we were looking for. We would always send out all of our things to the entire group. And then say if there was something we were prioritizing, say we're prioritizing this. But that way we were able to, and say pass it along, and then people would pass it along, and then we'd have people sign up for our group.
Cool. I think probably, yeah, last question. Could you share a little bit about how feedback from CUTgroup sessions were shared back with the clients? Did you kind of just end up giving them like the raw responses, or was it recorded, or did you like summarize? Yeah, not a problem. You're like super mom. You're like literally doing everything right now. So congrats and props to you.
Thank you.
For the folks on the live stream, the next thing is, thanks, is the post presentation. We'll do a Zoom call. So we'll drop this link in the chat as well, but we'll be starting the civic hacking portion of the evening where we'll do intros, announcements, and breakout groups. So I think with that, thanks again, Meera, for your time, and for everyone else, go forth and hack.
Thank you all for having me. I appreciate you giving me a chance.